Hello and welcome to Face to Face with me. I'm Daisy and we're a program that brings the world to your screen and where we meet people who make a difference to our world. And in this episode, I take you to meet a renowned and highly respected world leader, Lech Walesa, a worker and human rights activist whose solidarity trade union movement sparked the end of communist rule in Poland in the late 1980s and earning him the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, Walesa became the president of Poland in 1990 until 1995, overseeing the country's transformation into a free market economy and democracy with its first free parliamentary elections. Poland's overthrow of communist rule, meanwhile, marked the beginning of the end of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. Now, while no longer active in politics, President Walesa, however, continues to inspire the world and achieve international fame through his lectures promoting human rights, democracy and global peace. I was fortunate enough to be granted an exclusive interview with President Walesa during his visit here to Indonesia a while back. So, join me here for his thoughts and ideas on Face to Face with President Lech Walesa. April the 10th, 2010 was a dark day for Poland. A Polish Air Force Tu-154 carrying 89 passengers and 7 crew members was flying from Warsaw, capital of Poland, heading to Smolensk, Russia, when it crashed just north of the city, killing everyone on board. There were no survivors. The crash proved to be a catastrophe for the Polish people. Included among the fatalities were Polish President Lech Kaczynski and his wife Maria. Also on board the plane were many of Poland's highest military and civilian leaders. Ironically, the Polish delegation flew to Russia to mark the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre of thousands of Poles by Soviet forces during World War II. The accident was a shock not only to Poland, but also to the international world, as in one stroke the country lost the head of state and most of the nation's best and brightest. Days after the air disaster, Poland was plunged in mourning, as thousands of grieving Poles expressed their feelings of loss and regrets throughout the country. On the 11th of April, President Kaczynski's body was returned to Poland, and a state funeral was then conducted in Krakow on the 18th of April. Poland was then forced to think about her future and how to cope with this nationwide tragedy, as well as elect a new leader. Getting over the tragedy was not an easy thing. 3 months after the air crash, Poland held an early election to choose a new president. Władysław Komorowski emerged as winner on the election held on the 4th of July. Now, it must be hard for any country to have to face a catastrophe where all their leaders, including the president and the armed forces senior officers, were killed. However, it looks as if Poland has managed to move past the tragedy without too much stability. Now a fully democratic republic and a member of the European Union, Poland as a country has had a long and checkered history. The country was subject to invasions and occupations many times throughout the centuries, including by Nazi Germany and Communist Soviet Union during the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union instituted a new communist government in Poland, with the country becoming the People's Republic of Poland, proclaimed in 1952. For 3 decades after, communism reigned in Poland until a series of labor turmoil changed the country's political destiny. In 1980, organized in a trade union movement called Solidarity, the workers in Poland grew in strength to become a political force to be reckoned with, until it finally eroded the dominance of the Communist Party and winning at parliamentary elections. One man stood out at the helm of the Solidarity labor movement, transforming it into a powerful political party and eventually becoming himself Poland's first democratically elected president in 1990. That man was a worker at the Gdańsk shipyards. His name was Lech Wałęsa. In view of the recent tragedy in Poland, how is the nation coping with it? And what do you think is next for the country?
Russia pretended to be our friends for 50 years, and also throughout all those years, Russia never admitted that they are responsible for the Katyn's massacre of thousands of Poles.
Not long after the plane crash that took the lives of many Polish top leaders, Poland's best-known son and living legend Lech Wałęsa came to Indonesia. Wałęsa was Poland's first democratic president from 1990 until 1995, overseeing the country's transition from a communist country to a full-fledged democracy that earned her a membership in the European Union in 2004.
Joined by intellectuals, give way to the workers' key demands.
Mamy wreszcie niezależne, samorządne związki zawodowe. Mamy prawo do strajku.
The years between 1980 and 1990s, the world witnessed the power one man could do to bring about changes in his country. Unhappy with labor conditions at the Gdańsk shipyards where he worked, Lech Wałęsa led major worker strikes demanding for their rights to the ruling communist government at the time. It led to the formation of an independent trade union, Solidarność, or Solidarity, that grew into a powerful political force and a threat to the communist authorities.
Obowiązkiem moim jest wziąć tę odpowiedzialność. Chodzi o przyszłość Polski.
Lech Wałęsa was kept under constant surveillance by the state security and frequently arrested. Solidarność too was kept under control and eventually declared illegal, though it continued its activities as an underground movement. The Solidarity labor movement, however, gained the support of the free world, and Wałęsa was seen as an inspiration to end communist rule in the country. In 1983, Wałęsa was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, an international recognition that was significant for the movement. Moreover, increasing unpopularity towards the Polish government's policies and worsening economic conditions forced the government to cave in to popular demands that eventually saw the demise of the Communist Party in Poland. Wałęsa and his Solidarity Party won at parliamentary elections, becoming the first democratically elected president of the Republic of Poland in 1990 and transforming the country into a free democracy once and for all. These days, Poland's former president Lech Wałęsa is no longer in politics. However, his international fame continues, and he remains active as a voice of influence through his lectures and his visits around the world, such as to Jakarta, where I had the opportunity to share with him his thoughts and ideas on current issues. Okay, Your Excellency, welcome to Indonesia. It's a pleasure to have you in Indonesia. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your visit to Indonesia. I believe it's for quite a few days. What are your plans and what do you hope to get out from your visit to Indonesia?
Indonesia
is a huge country. It has a lot of islands and cultures, and it's almost half the size of Europe. I understand Indonesia has succeeded in uniting the country, so I would like to see perhaps there are some ways we can adopt for our Europeans' process of unification.
In view of the recent tragedy in Poland, how is the nation coping with it? And what do you think is next for the country?
Oczywiście nie wszystkich ludzi można szybko zastąpić, a niektórych się w ogóle nie da zastąpić.
Of course, there are many individuals that cannot be replaced. This tragedy has taken away our best intellectual elites. However, democracy has been established for quite some time now in Poland, so we have been coping with the situation well.
But what is the best way for the Polish people to embrace the future? Do you think it will disturb the stability of the country, perhaps the way forward for the country?
Nie. Jak powiedziałem, demokracja ma swoje prawa.
As I was saying, democracy has its own way of replacing people. Therefore, from the legal point of view, democracy has been functioning very well.
Demokracja właśnie funkcjonuje. I muszę powiedzieć, że
although with the loss of so many important people, it was a huge loss for us.
Funkcjonowanie jest prawidłowe. Oczywiście osób trudno jest zastąpić.
But what lessons could be learned from it, especially in view with relationships perhaps with Russia?
Otóż z sąsiadem, z Rosją mieliśmy burzliwe.
It is true that we used to have quite a bad relation with our neighbor Russia, terrible history. But on the other hand, tragedy do release certain positive emotions. So in a way, there has been positive signs in the relation between Poland and Russia.
Zmuszają do refleksji, a też i do lepszego zachowania.
Russia pretend to be our friends for 50 years, and also throughout all those years, Russia never admitted that they are responsible for the Katryn's massacre of thousands of Poles. Whereas now, after the tragedy, Russia has admitted that they are to blame. In a sense, we could say that this is the final end of World War II for Poland. We have finally found the murderers of our Polish officers in Katyn. But we also see this financial crisis as an important warning, as we realize that the world financial should not be controlled by a number of Americans, but should be controlled globally.
Kontrolowało cały biznes.
Time of global financial crisis where most of the world is affected by it and where the crisis itself is seen as errors made by financial executives and their decisions, Lech Walesa has his own views on the cause of the global financial crisis, and one that focuses more on the changing of attitude of us as human beings. Okay, and as a former president of Poland and the country's force for change, do you think, we have democracy in Poland, but is the country on the right path? And what are Poland's biggest challenges that the future government must deal with?
With democracy, everyone is entitled to have their own opinion. Meanwhile, me, as the former president of Poland, see democracy as proved to be effective and overall is going in the right direction.
The priorities for the future that the government should deal with, especially in view of the current global financial crisis. How is Poland affected?
W niektórych miejscach musimy dokonać nowych wyborów, jak prezydenta i innych ludzi, którzy zginęli.
We are now faced with certain tasks due to the tragedy. First, we need to carry out election and assign other officials. Also, Poland needs to accommodate its people with good living, and Poland needs to focus on integrating with the European Union and then needs to face the challenges of globalization.
Łączyć z Europą, aby zwrócić uwagę na globalizację i na wiele innych rzeczy.
But is the Polish economy affected at all with the financial crisis? I mean, are you worried with what is happening in Greece and perhaps the future of the European Union?
Kryzys dotknął wszystkie państwa i wszystkie narody.
Of course, the crisis affected many countries and in a way affected Poland too. But fortunately, as we have been very careful with our banking system, we somehow have coped with the crisis better than other countries.
Trochę łagodniej przejść przez ten kryzys. Ale kryzys ten bankowy odebraliśmy.
But we also see this financial crisis as an important warning as we realize that the world financial should not be controlled by a number of Americans, but should be controlled globally.
A cały świat miał jakiś wgląd do tego, by nie dać się kryzysowi podobnemu.
And we also consider the financial crisis as a warning that other further crises will follow unless the world is giving the right attitude toward this.
But do you still have faith in the European Union and the euro as a currency?
Ja wierzę, ale w inny sposób.
I look at it in a different perspective. Technology has developed so much that it is too confined for us to live in a small community.
Nie mieścimy się w państwie, w kraju. Na przykład kraj, nawet Indonezja, jest za mała jak na telewizję.
As an example, Indonesia, as a big nation as it is too small for satellite television, for mobile phones, and for other information technologies. We cannot confine environmental issues in one single country as well as financial crisis. In that sense, we need to enlarge our structure. Like for Europe, we adopt this unanimous attitude not to every aspect of our life, but for the essential ones. So if you ask me if I believe in European Union, I simply believe that we cannot stop the progress, and the progress is to enlarge the structures of how we organize ourselves.
And more strikes we see, and there are more and more tensions between workers and employers. Now, how to find a balance where both workers and employers work as a team and see and have the same objective? As an ordinary worker, workers' basic rights had been at the forefront of Walensa's fight against suppression and unfair treatment. Here in Indonesia, labor issues have never been easy to solve. The birth of democracy in this country and the freedom for workers to associate saw the emergence of various labor unions. This creates its own problems, however, as solidarity amongst trade unions is made complicated, with many unions and interests at stake, and with worker objectives often at odds with employers, often creating a climate of conflict. Issues such as wage, working conditions, outsourcing and termination are often the causes as companies struggle with costs, competition and challenging business climates. From the streets of Jakarta to the streets in Europe, the site is often similar and the methods the same. That is, taking their grievances to the streets. Similarly, in many parts of the world, especially in times of economic crisis and globalization, workers often resort to strikes and protests as employers are seen as not fulfilling their obligations or treating employees fairly. Workers often use strikes when they feel that dialogues are no longer effective tools of negotiations. But how effective are strikes in solving labor disputes? Well, for many of us not in their position, strikes often seem like an inconvenience. However, this situation is likely to continue for as long as employers and workers do not share the same objectives, refuse to carry their burden together, or rely on one another to solve their problems. Okay, one, of course, effect of the global financial crisis is rising unemployment, tensions between workers and employees. We see strikes in Europe, but there are also strikes in Indonesia. Now, there seems to be always conflicts between laborers and employers. How do you see this situation? What is the best way of addressing it?
I think things developed quite differently towards the end of 20th century. Until the end of 20th century, each country wanted to be more powerful than its neighbors so as to prevent the neighbor attacking us. So if we have this attitude, we will never focus on the weaker, only on the strong ones who could help us to get ahead of others. And hence there are so much injustices, so much harm inflicted, and that's why we have strikes.
Nie dominujemy, nie zamierzamy na nikogo napaść, to możemy zmienić koncepcję postępowania.
Now in Europe, we no longer fight against one another. We no longer want to dominate one another. We can change completely our attitude. We are now focusing on those who are weaker, to find jobs for them, so once they are employed, everybody could contribute to our general well-being. I think there are so much opportunities for work needed around the world, so there shouldn't be any worries for any form of unemployment. But we need to realize what we can do to our society to find them jobs, because there is enough work for everybody. For example, we need to restructure all our cities, including here in Jakarta, where there are such terrible traffic jams. This is to say, we've constructed our city in a wrong way.